Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. It's great to see some familiar faces here, and we also have a bunch of folks online. We wanted to bring you all here to discuss a really important and very relevant issue, which, of course, is the future of climate action in the United States. I think many of you have been, I'm sure, thinking about the issue, trying to figure out where do we go from here, given that there is now a U-turn in policy, I would say the fourth probably in the last as many administrations. And so there's a legitimate question about what the research tells us is actually happening, both in terms of the politics and the policy and the underlying trajectory of the energy transition, as well as the impacts and how we deal with them here in the United States. As a result, we pulled together expertise from across my program, the program on sustainability, climate, and geopolitics, and we brought together really a different set of ideas, both in terms of adaptation and mitigation. We very much encourage you to read the actual paper that was released last week during Climate Week. It has a lot more detail that we'll be able to cover today, but it's, I think, essential that it's part of the conversation. And today, we also will bring you two panels, which will also discuss the same issues with different perspectives. We don't want our paper, which we called Climate Clarity, to be the only perspective. And so you'll hear a lot of different views about how to move this along. I think ultimately what's essential is to have an open, honest, and fact-based discussion about what the future of climate action should be in the US. I think the first thing to note is that this U-turn we have seen is not just a function of an electoral outcome. It's also the product of a battle of ideas, which has, we characterize as a shift from the old denialism, which was simply saying that climate change isn't happening or is not man-made or human activity related, to the new denialism, which is today really what dominates policy and culture. The new denialism can be boiled down into a few bullets. Climate solutions don't work. They're too expensive. They're impractical. Sometimes they're just plain ugly. Decarbonization is too difficult and unrealistic a goal. It's important that we all make peace with the fact that fossil fuels are going to be with us forever, so the US might as well produce a lot more of them. Fossil fuels are good for the United States geopolitically, and renewables are good for China. And finally, climate change will inflict some damage, to be sure. I think new denialists don't oppose that, but they do say it's a small price to pay for progress, or as one of our cabinet secretaries put it, a modest negative trade-off overall, a price for progress. So now the new denialism that I just described is official policy. You'll see it in many different parts of our polity and our conversation. And so what we wanted to provide was an alternative, which we have called climate clarity, and it boils down into essentially 4 planks or 4 pillars. The first is that we think the new denialists are wrong, that clean energy solutions aren't working. In fact, what we argue in the paper is that climate solutions are working so well that the energy transition has now reached what we call escape velocity. And it will go on globally with or without the United States. A lot of that transition is now being led by China with Chinese technology. And the global south will not be easily persuaded to give up on that because it brings 2 important things. One is cost-effective solutions, and second, it loosens and breaks the ties of dependence that underpin energy security and which in an increasingly dangerous world, a lot of countries see as essential. Now let me avoid any confusion. What we're not saying is that oil demand has peaked. We're not saying that fossil fuels demand for fossil fuels has stopped growing. It hasn't. What we are saying is that clean energy has now eclipsed fossil fuels in terms of the share of the new energy that is being added globally. And now it's growing significantly faster than fossil fuel energy or high carbon energy. This is not a statistical blip. It's not the artifice of 1 year of big numbers. It's an established trend that has been years in the making. And that is what the transition looks like. Second point here is, well, what about the US, right? Fine, if you accept that the energy transition is moving, what role for the US then? We believe that out of self-interest, the US should be part of the energy transition and should not just sit on the sidelines and double down on fossil fuels. This will allow Americans to benefit directly from the fast-growing clean energy markets and enable the global transition to be faster. A global transition in which the US is a participant is a better one, a faster one, ultimately a safer one for all of us. Yes, the US is losing the race. We have another report from earlier this year demonstrating how the US is behind in many of the key areas of clean technology. But what this report suggests is just because you're losing the race, you shouldn't just walk off the field or leave the course, if you will. In fact, in the report, we identify a number of excellent opportunities around which the US can actually invest and become competitive. We call these subsurface transition technologies, and they include lithium extraction, next generation geothermal, carbon removal, and others. So you'll hear more about those during the panel. The third point is that we categorically reject the idea that climate change is a relatively modest risk or a relatively modest negative trade-off. The more you look at the research, as we do in this paper, and many others, of course, we're just one of many, it is very clear that climate risk is a major risk, and potentially a very major risk. Absolutely, we don't understand it's fully understand the intricacies of it. And absolutely, there are large uncertainty bands around both the timing and the magnitude of the impact. But that is a reason to be more cautious, not less. And so what we call for in the paper is that the United States adopt a risk management philosophy. As we do in government, as we do in private life, we need to, first of all, prioritize the protection of vulnerable groups who will be the first to get hit. We also call for providing Americans with the information they need to make climate-informed decisions about where to live, where to work, where to invest. And finally, we also call for facilitating the greater mobility inside the United States within and between different regions of the country, which will become an important adaptation strategy. And finally, we're not techno-utopians. We don't think technology alone is going to solve the problem. We believe that a new political coalition will be required. And the question, which we'll address later today, is, well, how do you build such a coalition? What we argue in the paper is that we'll need to connect systematically climate action to specific things that people care about, Americans care about a lot more at this moment, namely affordability and health. So that is what we call for how we call for a new narrative and a new approach that explicitly integrates climate action and helps us solve other problems that people are far more likely to vote on and to care about. So with that, we have two panels. The first one will focus on the clean energy transition component. That will be chaired by my colleague, Noah Gordon. The second panel will look at climate risk and the new narrative and the new coalitions. We'll do Q&A from the audience at the end, so please hold, after the first panel, hold your questions for later, and we'll still give everybody in panels 1 and 2 a chance to respond. Most importantly, please keep the conversation going. You'll hear many different ideas. Not all of them agree with each other, but they, I think, symbolize the beginning of a new dialogue about what true climate action could look like and how we get there, even as the environment and the world looks more challenging than ever. Thank you. Let me turn it over to Noah.
Thank you, Leo, and thank you all for being here at the Carnegie Endowment today. We're going to jump right in, and I'll introduce the great panelists we have on stage. We have next to me Jeremy A. Wallace, the A. Doak Barnett Professor of China Studies at Johns Hopkins SAIS, where he focuses on Chinese political economy and climate. Next to him, my friend and colleague Milo McBride, also from the Carnegie Climate Program. He's our clean energy technologies expert. And Catherine Fraser, the Climate Program Manager at Data for Progress, where she focuses on energy justice, climate justice, and carbon removal. We're going to do a rapid fire round to get started. As you all know, last week was Climate Week New York and the UN General Assembly. So maybe starting with you, Catherine, what's the one word you would use to sum up last week and explain it in 30 seconds?
Oh, gosh. Well, I fortunately still have my voice, so bear with me. A lot of shouting in crowded spaces in Climate Week. But my one word is affordability. I've been joking with my coworkers. It's the new A word. It's no longer abundance. We're talking about affordability, but lots of conversations about how we can actually address the cost of living crisis while also tackling climate change. I feel like that was a constant refrain at the events and panels, discussions I had at Climate Week.
It's a good one. Milo?
Yeah, hello everyone, good afternoon. My one word sentiment was recalibration, thinking back to these conversations that were pragmatic, clear-eyed about the scale of the challenge and really looking ahead at what in the coming years, what sort of technologies will be at the US's disposal to play, as Leo illustrated, a constructive role in the global decarbonization project. And really excited to talk about what those will be as this discussion goes on.
And Jeremy?
My one word would be unambitious. So as a China person, Xi Jinping addressed the UN Climate Assembly and kind of gave its updated climate commitments for the country, its NDC. And he tried to replicate the positive attention that came 5 years ago when he gave China's carbon neutrality pledge for 2060. But the update was nothing like that, and the kind of reception for it was positive but tepid. Obviously, compared to the denialism coming out of the United States, the kind of the message was welcome, but at the same time, it was a wholly unambitious set of targets that suggests that China is kind of yet to decide if it is interested in shutting down its coal sector, let alone like has figured out how it's going to do so.
I'll take moderator's privileges and ask myself the question. My word would be isolation. You know, for President Trump to go up in front of the UN and say that climate change is a green scam, a con job, really stood out, not just because it's the type of old school denialism that we don't see so much anymore, as we wrote in our paper, but also because this is a very different approach than what other major oil and gas producers are doing. You know, Saudi Arabia is importing as many Chinese solar panels as they can so they can save their oil for export. Even Russia attended the UN Climate Summit, only the US stood alone and stood apart. Milo, we're going to go to you for the first of our longer questions. You know, we write in our report that the clean energy transition has achieved escape velocity. Why do you think that?
Yeah. Hello. Can you hear me? Good. We describe this as escape velocity, and it's a complicated question of whether these technologies have reached a critical point where the cat is out of the bag. And I think that is our in-house view. But we caution that this is nuanced, and a nuanced response is needed. These revolutionary shifts in energy technology have not yet transpired in abating fossil fuel demand. And we are clear-eyed and honest about that in our analysis. At the same time, it is important for us all to conceptualize the timescales. The past decade, we've seen dramatic reductions in solutions that a decade prior were really not even possible at this scale. And now we are, what we believe is at the crux of a pretty seismic shift in global energy markets and correlated geopolitics. We think that renewables, electric vehicles, electrification technology will thus be the primary growth market in energy systems going forward, and that they will be the direction of travel for the mobility and power sectors. These markets, of course, are driven primarily, as we discussed, by China's newly found ability to produce these technologies at gargantuan scale and very low cost. I want to take solar PV as an example, which is not just the cheapest form of energy in our history, but the fastest growing energy source on the planet. And I was crunching some numbers before this, and you get to looking at the amount of solar panels that we're installing in a couple of days produce the electrical output that you could get from an annual generation of a coal or a nuclear plant. Like it's that sort of scale of deployment is really astounding. And we are seeing future breakthroughs of solar on the horizon. And this is, again, not to say that coal and gas are not growing. They are, but the growth is more modest comparatively. We also believe that there's a critical juncture, at least for the power sector, of a new denialist talking point that's breaking, that these systems are unreliable. In 2017, the first commercial-scale battery storage was installed in Australia. It's really not that long ago, less than a decade ago. It was a 100-megawatt battery plant. Today, we are installing 60, 70 gigawatts of batteries on the grid every year. And we are learning how to balance a highly renewable penetrated grid with other software and hardware. So the idea that these would play a marginal role in a decarbonized power system are, again, looking less likely. And we're seeing parts of Australia, parts of Europe, being able to do this quite effectively. And lastly, on this technology note, the rise of electric vehicles, I think, for many of us working on this for a while, is pretty outstanding. Now, a quarter of all car sales in the world have a plug, and over 50% of car sales in China are in some form electric. And this is no longer a luxury Tesla auto market story. These are penetrating Thailand, Ethiopia, Brazil at astounding rates. And we think the technologies in those batteries are going to accelerate and make these more cost-effective and just a better product to drive. These forces all culminate at a pretty seismic shift in our geopolitical order and in correlated trade architectures. And in this more precarious moment globally, we believe that the idea of having an insulated power grid with domestic renewables, with electrification technology, is an enticing value proposition against hydrocarbon incumbents, which are just inherently fuel volatile. And we saw that following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. This view, of course, is consensus. We see it throughout the investment community, Carlyle Group, JP Morgan, publishing reports that argue analogous kind of outlooks globally. I'll end with just saying, where does this position the US if this is to be the base case? And our view is that the US should not hitch its star solely to hydrocarbons. We need a diversification strategy for the United States. And that one Leo had mentioned is one that is more pragmatic, one that acknowledges the American strength as a hydrocarbon superpower, that we have hundreds of thousands of oil and gas workers here, and looks to the subsurface as a point of a transition strategy. At Carnegie, we've been moving full force, drilling deep, pun intended, on geothermal energy, which is an undervalued, underappreciated decarbonization solution. For context, the IEA saying nearly a terawatt of clean, firm geothermal power is possible by mid-century. This is something that American oil and gas workers can do and has a unique place of bipartisan support. This is one of several of the subsurface transition technologies that if the US could focus on and emphasize its technology policy, its innovation policy, there could be a pretty, let's say, transformative, productive role that the US could play in this shifting landscape.
I really like the point you made about where the transition is happening. I mean, markets where EV sales are more than 40% of new sales include Nepal, Djibouti, and Tajikistan. And if you think those countries are doing it because they're woke or decadent or because the Paris Agreement made them do it, I don't know what to tell you. This is happening. There's a bottom-up boom going on in solar and in places like Pakistan. Jeremy, Catherine, do you want to come in on this question of the energy transition potentially having achieved escape velocity?
I could say one point, which is that I do worry a little bit about that metaphor because sometimes you see inevitable also as used. And I think both escape velocity and inevitable, I would say that we have achieved clean energy economics that are powerful. But I worry a little bit about assuming away the politics, assuming that things will continue without effort, which kind of escape velocity and inevitability suggest. And so with that caution, but in general, I really do appreciate Milo's remarks and agree with the overall point that the clean energy transition feels cheaper, cleaner, and better than the fossil fuel energy system that we live in today.
It's also yet another metaphor that comes from combustion. It's hard to talk about any of this without drilling down or stepping on the accelerator. Catherine, you had something?
I was going to say something very similar to Jeremy, and speaking especially to the U.S. context and thinking about how do you build a broad base of support for an energy transition, thinking about the politics, how do you build a coalition? And to get back to the affordability piece I mentioned already, thinking about how we can actually deliver material benefits to people's lives in the forms of lower utility bills, a more reliable grid, affordable transit options. So thinking about how do we actually, build the coalition and build a broad base of public support so that we can keep growing the energy transition both here and abroad.
It's a good point about affordability. We're going to come back to that on this panel on the next one. One reason we need to do so much thinking about it is it's not a completely new idea. On the Heat Map podcast this morning, they pointed out that the last big climate bill was called the Inflation Reduction Act. Like, we did try a version of this a few years ago, the American climate community. Maybe moving to you, Jeremy, and focusing on China. It's hard to talk about clean energy without talking about China. One of the ideas in new denialism is that the US maybe should slow down the transition to clean energy because doing so will play into the hands of China, the electrostate superpower. How should the US think about China when it comes to clean energy? As a competitor, a potential collaborator, a bit of both. What do you think?
I do think it's important to remember that China is the kind of key player, the protagonist, you could argue, of the global climate change story as both the problem, the core of the problem. It's by far the world's largest emitter, at over 30% of global emissions every year coming out of China. And not just because they're exporting things to the rest of the world for Chinese use, So consumption-based measures still show that. But it's also the core of the key solutions are dominated by Chinese producers. And so in this sense, like focusing on China, it's good for business, but as a China person, but it is also, I think, just the reality of the situation. And so thinking through deeply where is China likely to go and where should the United States kind of position itself vis-a-vis China is, I think, a key portion of the story. And so 3 kind of points along to answer your question. One is that solar dependence or dependence on clean energy technologies like solar, wind, or batteries are very different than fossil fuel dependence. We have national security advisors in the United States now and previously that kind of like make the connection that, well, we can't become dependent on Chinese solar panels like Europe was on Russian gas. And I think that just really portrays an ignorance or a kind of misunderstanding of the technologies and their differences. Once you buy a solar panel, it will work for you until when the sun shines, until it no longer works, or it's snowing, I guess. But there are times, like that's just not the case for fossil fuels. You need a continuous flow, and that continuous flow represents a real point of leverage that the provider has over the recipient in a way that just doesn't exist. If the flow of solar panels somehow were cut off, then that doesn't turn off the power of the panels that you already own. And so I think that kind of like level of dependence and what dependence means for security is just a key point of difference. Second, and thus becoming dependent on Chinese kind of low commodity exports of solar panels is very different than kind of hydrocarbons. Second, Chinese firms are tech leaders in this space. They are not just kind of like taking advanced technologies from other places and making them. They are the tech leaders in this space. And so for me, the kind of connection is that American firms should be interested in, and the American government should be interested in encouraging Chinese investment in the United States in order to have Americans participate in the construction of next generation, but also just current generation best of line technologies. And to not do that ignores the reality that this is how you actually develop a technological capacity and an industrial capacity is not just through technological developments, but also process learning of actually building these things. The idea that we could just invest in next generation batteries and somehow move forward just does not really work with the present realities. If we're not building at scale today, we're not going to be able to build at scale tomorrow. Finally, I do think that there are lots of economic opportunities that kind of are available to the United States and play to US strengths in a way that are a little bit different than what the Chinese have taken up. So there's a lot of role for finance and software to move the energy transition forward. It's a lot cheaper and better to be able to build an energy system that only has 2 or 3 times as many solar panels instead of 4 or 5 times as many solar panels just because of land is so costly, if we can be more efficient about the way that we kind of manage demand or kind of manage storage or price it such that we can encourage their development more economically. And so I think the idea that, and China is not moving forward very sufficiently or very economically in these domains. It has not figured these parts out. Texas and California are both far ahead in terms of like really navigating and integrating high levels of renewables at scale and kind of shifting power from the daytime to evening. And so I would kind of be there, and then I'm curious what others think on this point as well.
Marla, maybe to bring you in on what Jeremy brought up about leapfrog technologies, and we talk about playing to U.S. strengths, and one of those is technological innovation. Where do you, and also, Jeremy and Catherine too, what do you think about this balance between doing what the U.S. is good at and wanting to manufacture so that you can get process innovation and have national security objectives achieved?
Yeah, it's a challenging trilemma in and of itself, and it's something we were working on in a past project pretty actively, trying to understand how you balance where essentially you put money. Do you onshore a technology? Do you focus on the potential to innovate? Jeremy's point, well taken, you need some sort of industrial base before you can innovate. In a vacuum, there are certain criteria of one, is this essential to national security concerns that would presumably have some level of bipartisan durability. Today, I think we're just at a point in the United States where let's see what sort of industrial base survives the policy shift, and pragmatically looking at that, taking stock of that, and understanding how we can work within it. To me, the areas that are most exciting and interesting are actually not in a sector we're talking about yet, is really in the industrial decarbonization space. This is the hardest to abate, as it's called, things like cement, steel, chemicals, which the United States has a robust pipeline of companies right now actually producing the first low to zero carbon cement. And these are not companies that were subsidy dependent on Inflation Reduction Act tax credits. And they're moving forward. They're moving forward despite policy U-turns. And this is, to me, one of those areas where it's not just interesting from a kind of bipartisan emphasis on building and industry as a kind of golden object, but also as an area where innovation is urgently needed for abating carbon emissions, right? The next-gen battery tech, the Koreans have it, the Europeans have it, the Chinese have it. We have it too in the United States, but this type of clean steel, clean cement production is really essential. The other space is going back to the subsurface. The geothermal story is just happening fast, right? I think that's what's most enticing. When you compare it to next-gen nuclear, which outside of China is still a 2030-ish story, we're going to see the first next-gen geothermal plants probably online next year. Like, that is a timescale that we need for the climate challenge. And when we look at other interesting areas where I think technology push policy, innovation policy could help, is looking at whether or not we can fundamentally produce hydrogen very cheaply from the subsurface. And it's a big debate right now amongst geologists. But if so, it would be cheap, affordable, and ultimately change this pretty sticky challenge that the world is in, where hydrogen, clean hydrogen, is just proving pretty expensive. So those are some of my 2 cents, and yeah, would love to hear Catherine's.
Yeah, my comments are much more high level, taking a big step back, because I feel like China has come up in so many conversations in DC. I work at Data for Progress. We're a polling firm. We do a lot of public opinion research. And in talking with Hill offices or other folks in the space in DC, people are always asking, how much should we be talking about China, especially when it relates to climate change? And I find it useful to collectively remind ourselves, as people who occupy the Beltway space, that this is really a Beltway conversation. We've tested some of these messages and some of these frames, and the average voter just is not thinking about China in relation to the energy transition. They might not even be thinking about the energy transition at all. And we've also done some testing of a message saying that the US needs to compete with China in the energy transition versus the US needs to compete globally in the energy transition, and they are pretty comparable. This is not something that's necessarily breaking through to voters. So I want to say it because I feel like it's come up so often in the last few months. But again, kind of big picture, at Data for Progress, we recognize that we're in dire straits on climate. We are even more off target when it comes to meeting our own climate goals, global climate goals, thinking about the 1.5C or 2 degrees C target. So I'm much more for an all hands on deck approach over some sort of new Cold War with China over the energy transition. That said, I think there's a thoughtful conversation to be had, and you have some wonderful experts to my left about which sectors it may make sense to be more competitive versus more cooperative. I think there's a nuanced conversation to have, but would caution against kind of going full force against China when we really need to decarbonize as fast as possible.
Jeremy, any closing thoughts on China based on that?
I think that there is a DC sense in which China can be used as a way to kind of create whatever political opening for whatever policies that you want. And I think Catherine's point is really well taken. I don't think that that's a broad American view. I don't think that there is an excitement about a new Cold War in anywhere outside of the Beltway. And I think that that's really important when we think about this conversation. When we think about the technologies that might have national security implications, where we might be more concerned about Chinese dependence, I think about maybe some of the battery technologies, because we think that drones are important for warfare and we want to be able to have kind of like our own manufacturing capacity. That's one thing, but solar panels are a very different thing. And so we're not going to be throwing solar panels at each other in any conflict anytime soon. So that's where I would end up.
It's something new for the US, which is used to being the technological leader, and that's not the case in some of these clean energy sectors. Catherine, I want to go back to you. You brought up some of the Data for Progress public opinion data. something from there or from your own thoughts on which sectors the U.S. should focus on, if the U.S. should focus on its strengths. We write in this paper that the U.S. is not going to lead the transition. It could and should play an important supporting role. So anything on the sectors the U.S. should focus on?
Yeah, for sure. Happy to speak to that. And in the climate clarity piece you all write, you do a great job of emphasizing that the U.S. still matters on climate. And I just want to re-up that. We're historically the largest greenhouse gas emitter, not probably telling most people in this room anything new, but we have a huge responsibility to act on climate for a whole host of reasons. And that means actually acting. So cutting emissions, investing in clean energy, deploying finance both domestically to invest in clean energy, but also supporting the global transition, thinking about the global south and our responsibility for historic emissions. So just want to first and foremost emphasize that point. In terms of certain sectors and technologies, I think you all make some great points in the climate clarity piece around research and development and the U.S.'s strengths in R&D. I think where we're at with solar and wind in the U.S. is a lot to the credit of our research and development capacity in the U.S. So I'm particularly excited about R&D for advanced batteries, advanced geothermal, advanced nuclear. I work a bit on carbon removal and thinking about how far we are from those technologies actually being deployable at scale and the scientific consensus that we do need some form of carbon removal. And so thinking about how we can use our research and development to deploy these sorts of technologies. I also wanted to mention EVs, as Milo brought up. Safe to say that the U.S. and the big three automakers are pretty woefully behind China and the world in building EVs and deploying them, but also recognizing that the big three in the auto industry in the U.S. has historically had some pretty high union density, and there's a lot of power, and that's a strength in my view that we have this union workforce. And so thinking about how we can push capital, push these automakers to actually, start catching up on EVs and also shore up, the workforce of the future that's union. So thinking about kind of both in the technological sense, but also like what our other strengths are in terms of labor, et cetera, in the US. I can speak more on carbon removal. I think like the biggest thing is public investment. To get the technology where we need to go, and also it's a public good. This is something that we're gonna need public dollars. We're gonna need the state to deploy carbon removal at scale, and we can't just rely on the private sector to lead. Happy to share more on some public opinion pieces, but I can stop there for now.
I will, Milo, leave it a two-finger on carbon removal.
Yeah, I just cannot emphasize enough that, and to bring it back, hopefully, to this nuanced take that we have of where the global energy system is, we are going to overshoot. And we need gigaton scale project of drawing down carbon, and we are further away from understanding how to draw down methane. Something I heard a lot during Climate Week, which I think ties into this, and I would love to touch on the actual innovation side, is that if the US is to re-engage the world someday on climate, then having some type of olive branch to offer with the historical points that you alluded to will be essential. And I think that some type of grand vision of removal, in the essay we refer to it as a Operation Warp Speed or Manhattan Project scale vision of how we could holistically think about removing carbon dioxide at speed and scale from the atmosphere. And today, the primary technology is direct air capture, DAC, which is slowly but surely moving along. The costs are not yet at this sweet spot of $100 a ton of carbon, which presumably is when this starts to work out. But there are other ways we could think about this, particularly oceanic removal, understanding how to better use ocean systems, which is just far away compared to the DAC side. And yeah, as a planet and within our planetary limits, there's mass urgency. And I'll just end with saying urgency also for science diplomacy, for pooling scientific minds of oceanic studies, of geologists, of material scientists together to try and understand what are the most effective, cost-effective, and rapid solutions for an existential challenge.
Mm-hmm. Earlier, I sort of gleefully made the point that people are installing clean energy all over the world out of self-interest. That is definitely not the case for carbon removal. That's why, Jeremy, your point was so important earlier. The governments have to play a role here. No, it doesn't do anything for you to remove carbon from the atmosphere. There's no market for it, and it takes strong government action. And we're very excited about the addition of clean energy, but there's a lot of work to be done when it comes to technologies like CDR. And the scale of it, Milo, as we write in the paper, we're currently removing about 2 million tons a year using novel carbon removal technologies, and emissions are 40 billion tons a year. So not even close to being close. Catherine, maybe going back to you on, we're moving closer to messaging and wrapping up here to get to the next panel, which will focus more on that and also on the union question you brought up. What do you think about this, our idea of focusing more on health and affordability? As I said, it's not exactly new, and there's more politicization of climate, less. It's what everyone's talking about right now. You have Senator Brian Schatz last week saying cheap energy is clean energy. You have all sorts of different firms saying affordability means all of the above. Affordability means taxes on fossil fuel firms. How do you think about this affordability question?
Yeah, it's a great question. And just to start, one of the 4 kind of pillars of the climate clarity piece, the final one, is that tech innovation isn't going to be enough. And I think this really gets at the affordability piece and thinking about where voters are at. I mean, we see in our data that voters are reporting rising costs of utility bills, of groceries, of housing, healthcare. That's really front of mind for folks. People also think that climate change is going to financially affect them in the US. That's growing. There's a majority of voters who think that. So despite the successes we had with the IRA, with the bipartisan infrastructure law, we didn't do enough to materially improve people's lives. And I think that that's where we need to think about a bigger project, not just focusing on one technology or one sector, but especially, when there's a chance in the US to have federal climate action again, like how do we think about state capacity? How do we think about a managed transition where we're phasing out fossil fuels and scaling up clean energy, where we're actually scaling carbon removal at the pace we need? And there's a massive role for the state. We cannot do it without the state. And I think we're in a really sad time for state capacity as it's being decimated left and right, and climate actions are being walked back. But I think it's also an opportunity to think about what it would take to get where we need to go. Asking questions about how can we rebuild state capacity to make sure that people materially benefit in the transition. There are going to be bumps in the road, so how do we craft social policy to actually support Americans when there are those bumps in the road during the transition? It's not going to be a smooth path. New technologies aren't going to one-to-one replace fossil technologies. So I think we need to be really thoughtful about a bigger project beyond just decarbonizing. And I think that's where one learning from the IRA and where we fell short is not delivering meaningfully for cost. So I think thinking about some sort of big scale managed transition will be really key to actually deliver on the affordability concerns we're repeatedly seeing among voters. And I would say too, there's been a lot of discussion about shying away from talking about climate, that Democrats in particular should not talk about climate. And I disagree with that a bit. I think we can be thoughtful about how we talk about climate. And climate is a pocketbook issue, and so tying it to people's everyday lives is going to be essential. It's also something we know most people care about in the US. A majority of Americans want to take action on climate. That includes a majority of Republicans. So we can have a bold vision for the future, and I think having a positive message versus some sort of negative anti-China message will actually give more hope and more optimism to build that sort of coalition to act on climate.
I like what you said about the importance of materially improving people's lives. And one idea about linking climate to health, Leo and I have talked about this before, what if you replace the HVAC system in every school in the country? And you say you're doing it because kids, it's hot and kids need to be air conditioned, and they do better when it's cool in the room and where the air is filtered and they're healthier. We had a pandemic recently. And by the way, you're doing it all with heat pumps. Even though the idea of using an affordability or a health frame is not new, there's still a lot of new thinking to be done. And Milo, you talked earlier about Manhattan Project, Apollo Project, Operation Warp Speed. Whatever you want to say about the current moment, it's a time when people are thinking big. It is a time of rupture and when new policies are on the table. So there's a possibility for new actions within a familiar lens. We just have a few minutes left. I want to maybe go to each of you for a closing statement or a last message to the audience before we move to our next panel. Jeremy?
So I guess I would give the difficult news that if China, with its authoritarian system, is having difficulty dealing with the politics of the climate transition, the fact that it's difficult in a democracy is perhaps unsurprising. That being said, I do think that there's a lot of, the United States is a large country, and that physical largeness is important for space. So the clean technologies that are likely to dominate, wind and solar, including geothermal, like having space, physical space is actually quite important. It does increase the difficulty of transmission and everything else along those lines, but there is a sense in which having the space, getting more energy from the sun, having more earth that you can dig into the subsurface from. The United States has immense natural resources, and so the ability, the resources are there, and I think increasingly, especially as other places move forward, there will be a increasing demand for these technologies.
Two thoughts on my end. One is more of a question. The urgency, and stepping back from my usual perch, the urgency of addressing the affordability and health crises in the United States is severe. And in this moment of thinking about policy and thinking about delivering, one thing just to interrogate is, how do you deliver for people quickly? Are there examples of other countries, other policy regimes that have done so in a way that is equitable and that makes people's lives better and makes constituents feel seen? That is a political, social question I don't have an answer to, but I think in this nexus of climate, health, and affordability is worth interrogating. And then I'd love to just touch on this point of the fact that climate is increasingly less, at least from the polling that you do, it is less of a kind of non-starter politically than it is viewed. And I hate to be the clear-eyed optimist, but I do think that there are actual angles to think about building coalitions in a multi-partisan, transpartisan way that draw in voices. And this is a moment to think about that. And for the climate moment, I think there are some really big opportunities. And to just plug again the fact of this subsurface idea, this is actually the first time in our kind of technological history where you have maybe our biggest decarbonization opportunity not being at odds with the fossil fuel workforce, but one that actually needs their expertise. And you think back to the Obama era coal to coding policy, which was basically, once we shut the coal towns down, we can teach people to code. This is just a kind of ridiculous presumption of labor that does not honor the skills that our workforce has. And how we can think about that as a labor strategy, to me, is new, and that is exciting.
Marla, I had a question now. The rest of you, please save your questions for the end. We'll take them at the end of the next panel. Catherine, last word, take us home.
Yes, would wholeheartedly re-up what Marla was just saying. We have some really interesting new data that we're seeing that most Americans are experiencing and are identifying that there are increasing climate change related or extreme weather events in their daily lives. People are recognizing that things are changing. We also were in the field this summer doing focus groups in coal communities in really rural parts of Colorado. And that was one of the first times being in the field for me, talking about climate change. And don't really know how it's always going to get a response, especially, I don't know, I had my priors on with a red place, a rural place. But people were nodding along, like, oh yeah, we are experiencing this. We don't have as much snowpack, there's more wildfires. This isn't something that's far off anymore. I think it's much more in the American imagination, and that's something we can think about in talking about climate policy and crafting climate policy. The last thing I'll say is this last election was not a climate election. This was all about the economy and the cost of living. And so I think we can take a lot of lessons from that. And thinking about, as people who care about climate and who want to craft the future of climate policy in the US, we also need to care about the fact that most Americans are struggling to afford housing. They're struggling to, get groceries, make rent, and that's a problem. If we want to have a dignified planet where everyone has access to a stable climate, we also need to take care of people's basic needs. And to be honest, we're not succeeding right now in the US. So I think thinking about this as one piece of a broader affordability agenda will be critical.
I love that last point. We don't always have a shared set of facts in this country, but everyone knows how much your power bill is, how much your grocery bill is, how much your home insurance costs. We're going to take a 4-minute break now before the next panel. Please join me in giving these panelists a round of applause. Thanks.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back. We are now back online, and we will continue with our second panel. So this is the second phase of the day, the discussion. We'll be focused on a couple of subjects. One is science, the climate science, where is it headed? How does it inform the conversation, the national debate? And also this issue that already came up in the last panel. How do we then try to think about what kinds of coalitions, what kinds of narratives could be effective in doing some of the policies that we discussed earlier in terms of climate action. We have, let me start with the science. I'll just introduce folks as we go along, if that's all right. Gretchen Goldman is President and CEO of Union of Concerned Scientists. You will have seen her in a very famous viral video from 2020, which I just learned about, as well, of course, as her writings in leading scientific journals. I think the first question, Gretchen, here is, the science provides us with that backbone for a shared facts conversation, right, about climate. We've seen, I think, over the last several months, a real, and not just several months, several years, really, perhaps even since COVID, a decline in trust of so-called experts, a decline in scientists, in trust in scientists, generally the public becoming more suspicious of expertise in general, including in climate and, of course, in health. But now I think we see really a more dangerous type of dismantling of capacity and institutions that have been for a long time the cornerstone of scientific inquiry in the US. I'm wondering how our scientists, what role do scientists have in resisting this push? And also, how do we recapture trust and confidence in expertise, scientific inquiry?
Yeah, that is one question that keeps me up at night. There's a ton to go through on that. I think first I'll just say at a high level, we're seeing this attack on science and scientists at a scale that we haven't seen before. The pace, the severity, the scale of what's happening in the federal government with science and scientists is truly extraordinary. My organization, the Union of Concerned Scientists, tracks attacks on science, we call them. So anytime across any administration, there's a dismissal of expertise, a suppression of scientific data, or other scientific integrity-like issues. And over the entirety of the first Trump administration, we tracked 206 of those. And in this second Trump administration, we're already up to 402. So we're seeing nearly double in under a year what we saw in the entirety of the first Trump administration. And so we're seeing just a huge escalation of that, and then the destruction of federal agencies, federal science agencies, and some of the independent checks on power, the institutions within agencies that normally provide that trust, that scientific expertise within the federal government is also being dismantled in much, much deeper ways than we have seen previously. And that's providing a very new context. If you combine that with the decline in public trust that we're seeing more broadly around decline in trust in institutions. For science, it's sort of interesting to look at the polling. The Association of Science and Technology Centers this year did actually come out with recent polling that still were fairly positive for trust in scientists and experts and wanting them to be involved in decision making. But I think there is still this overall decline that we need to figure out as the scientific community and explore what we do about that in a bigger way, and how do we rebuild that trust with both with the public and influence over decisions to make sure we can get more evidence-based decision making across the board, across issue areas. And so in terms of pushing back, I think we're seeing the science community at large and the climate science community in particular get smart about how to respond to a lot of the denialism that we're seeing. My organization does a lot of work with scientists to mobilize them, to leverage expertise and connections to the scientific community, to put pressure on Congress, to work on making sure there's more evidence-based decision-making happening across all levels of government. And that's been a really important tactic, and as well as in the courts and other ways of pushing back to make sure that we can do as much as we can to preserve science-informed decisions. We're seeing that really be needed now with the attacks on the use of science in decision making. So like the EPA endangerment finding attacks we're seeing under this administration, they're really looking at going after the legal and scientific underpinning that allows action on climate across the board. We saw scientists do what they do best and do a giant document in response with point-by-point citations about why they're wrong. And we also saw quicker actions in terms of fighting in the courts, of pushing back, of trying to use every lever we can to do what we can in this moment. And the bigger point I'd make about how to push back in this moment, we're seeing there's a need to do more outside of government, to have an independent, to build independent scientific institutions outside of government. So one element of this is science advice. So across federal agencies, there's science advisory committees. This is one element of what we're seeing that's being gutted under this administration. And there's an opportunity to reconvene these science advice bodies outside of government so they can continue to provide that transparency, that build that public trust, and also provide that science advice to other levels of government, to the public, even in the absence of federal leadership. And that's one way, too, that we're seeing as a way to counterbalance any of the misinformation that's coming out of this administration, and otherwise sort of keep the science going, keep that opportunity for evidence-based decision-making happening across the board. And I think we need, another reason we need that kind of strategy now is because of this attacks on institutions, the targeting of academic institutions, and other pillars of society has really created this chilling effect in the scientific community. And so the more we can unite, can do things as groups, as coalitions of groups that can allow us to push back more effectively and do so in a way that keeps everyone in a safer place.
One real concern is what I would call the privatization of a public good, right? As data and knowledge that is created by the federal government begins to be scaled back, it doesn't end the need for the data and the information, right? The private sector, the banks, the private equity, the large corporations, the hedge funds, they all want the data because it's essential to their ability to make money and to protect their assets and so on, right? And they'll buy the data. It'll become privatized, they'll collect it. But that means there's a lot less data out there for the public to use, and for local government, states, many others. How to try to counter that trend?
Right. This is one element that's been very alarming to me, is this privatization or the lack of public R&D resources. The attacks on research grants is also something that's really happening at a bigger scale in this administration than we had ever seen previously. And because that has largely been buffered from political influence. You know, over the years, of course, there's been politicization of scientific research dollars and grant-making processes, but we've never seen this sort of wholesale carving out of the research enterprise across the federal government, and that's a big problem because a lot of the federal government and the public interest in research is not going to one-for-one match what the private sector would be interested in when it comes to science and research and development and data collection. And as you said, they're not incentivized to make that data public in a way that people can access it, people can use it, and people can trust it. And so we're really going to suffer the consequences collectively of that gutting of resources at the federal level, and that's across scientific disciplines and when it comes to health data, when it comes to climate information and data, all across the government, there's a lot of that provides, I would say, too, another independent check on what the government is doing because it's accessible, because communities can see if they're getting a disproportionate amount of pollution, and we can see, you know, if there's a discrepancy in the medical data that is going into decisions, right? And that has allowed sort of one public accountability metric that we're also potentially losing.
Let me move to the next three speakers who are really, I think, collectively addressing different parts of the climate clarity conversation, and that is how do we build coalitions that can be sustainable for climate action. Let me first turn, let me go to the screen after Ben. But Ben, you have put together a paper. You have, it has the, I think, great name of a popular climate agenda, a blueprint for a popular climate agenda. Can you tell us a bit, what is this framework, this blueprint, and how does it avoid some of the pitfalls of the IRA, the Green New Deal, the various other efforts over the years that have tried to do something similar but have not succeeded?
Thanks for the question, and thanks for organizing. The climate community right now is undergoing a bit of dysphoria, in case that wasn't apparent. And I think that's natural, like it makes sense, but we do need to move forward. And in times like this, I think it's important that we brush ourselves off, reorient, and build what comes next. And part of the process of reorienting, I think, requires us to be real about what has worked and what has not worked. There's a tendency in moments of loss like this to just throw the baby out with the bathwater and say, well, yeah, everything we've tried hasn't worked. Let's just start fresh, throw out all of our strategies and start with a blank slate. And I think that tendency is really based on vibes, not evidence. And so if we actually look at the evidence, which elements of our strategy would it suggest we should carry forward, and which elements should we revise? A core element of the strategy that led to the Inflation Reduction Act was a premise that we can actually unite climate, jobs, and justice goals, that we can deliver on all three at the same time. And that's why in the law you see a lot of the climate investments paired with labor and equity standards, right? Now this premise caught a bunch of flack. There were definitely naysayers who said we were trying to do too much, that if you're really serious about climate, you might want to just leave the jobs and justice pieces behind. We were guilty of a quote-unquote everything bagel strategy. I don't know if you've had an everything bagel. Here's the thing about them. They taste really good. And they taste really good for a reason. They combine ingredients that pair well together. Garlic, onions, and sesame seeds, which is not unlike climate, jobs, and justice. I mean, seriously, these two can pair well together. Because we know that to tackle the climate crisis, we need to mobilize trillions of dollars in investments, in climate investments. Properly guided, that wave of investments can flow into good union jobs. Properly guided, it can flow into communities that have endured decades of divestment. Properly guided, our climate strategy is a job strategy, is an equity strategy. And at this point, that's not just theory, that's practice. Though Republicans just rolled back large parts of the IRA, we actually have 3 years of data on IRA implementation. And what does that data suggest but progress on all three fronts? Last year, we saw a record 49 gigawatt boom in clean energy installations. We have now reached the highest ever union density in the clean energy sector in recorded history. We had 3/4 of these investments flowing to low-income communities. That win-win-win is not an accidental outcome. It's the deliberate result of an intentional everything bagel strategy. And yet there's a second premise that was undergirding this strategy that has very much gone unfulfilled. And that is that by linking climate investments with economic benefits, we would spur this broad-based popular demand to defend those investments and to enact new ones. And I think it's safe to say that that has not materialized. A demand for more waves of climate investments is hardly on the tips of most working folks' tongues. And so I think we have to be real about that and ask why not? What were the gaps in our strategies? I'll briefly name 3 gaps, and I think filling these gaps is the architecture of our forward-looking climate agenda. The gap number 1, affordability. We need to do more to design and enact climate policies that offer serious responses to the cost of living crisis. I think it's notable that the original Build Back Better agenda included bold investments targeting the primary sources of rising costs for most American families. Significant investments in energy-efficient, affordable housing. Significant investments in care, elder care and child care. Significant investments in public transit to reduce transportation costs. Cut, cut, and cut during the sausage making that yielded the IRA. Going forward, we have to fill in that gap. We need to do a lot more to design policies that cut climate pollution and costs at the same time. Number 2, speed. We have to reduce the long lag time between passing a law, standing up new investments, building a thing, and having the economic benefits of that thing materialize on the ground. If you look at some of the clean manufacturing investments in the IRA, that lag time is approximately 6 years. That is tragically 2 years longer than your average presidential administration. And thus, if we cannot deliver real meaningful results that people actually feel within the span of an electoral timeline, then the political economy of our everything bagel strategy has a sizable hole in it. That was definitely an intended pun. So the abundance discourse that we've heard a lot of recently rightly spotlights this problem, right? Like they're all about speed, and they get the goal right. We absolutely must expedite clean energy build out. That is critical both for the emissions math and for the political calculus. But to do so, we've got to be precise about what is causing clean energy delays. And if you look at the data, you actually ask clean energy developers themselves, they've named their 5 biggest sources of clean energy delays. 4 of the 5 don't point to an excess of policy, but an absence of policy. As just one example, it takes 5 years to connect your average solar project to the electrical grid due to a lack of systemic planning of grid build-out. The solution to that, pretty much everyone agrees, is more policy, more green industrial policy to systemically plan our grid build-out. Going forward, we're going to need to design more of these policies that actually expedite clean energy. And number 3, the third gap that points the way forward, I think, is inclusion. I think a third reason that we have not seen this broad clamor for more and more waves of climate investments is due to a lack of broad involvement in designing those investments. To build buy-in for the climate agenda, I think we need an agenda that is not written about workers and communities, but by them. And I'm happy to elaborate on what I mean by that.
Thanks so much. And I think let me turn to Patrick here. Patrick's the director of CCI's research department, climate communities. Your vision, which you call green economic populism, is similar. It has, I think, at the base of it, the concept of trying to bring together affordability, community, and addressing inequality at the same time. I think the same critique that could be made of the blueprint could be made here, which is, are we taking on too much? Is this too complicated? Is this the reason why speed didn't work, right? And of course, we take your points about being very precise about what's slowing down the projects. But how does your approach, Patrick, address this trade-off?
Yeah, thanks so much for the question, and thanks for inviting me to participate today. I appreciate you making me able to participate remotely. So in thinking about these trade-offs, I think in order to even get to the trade-offs, we have to think about what narratives we're using and which coalitions we're building in order to get to the stage where we're grappling with those. And so maybe one way of starting to address this question is with a little story in Maine, which is maybe an unexpected place when we're talking about the front lines of the climate crisis, because the biggest city has 69,000 people. They're in the bottom of the country by income, and the economy relies on waterfronts, working lands, and tourism. And Mainers have been hit hard by the affordability crisis. Housing prices are skyrocketing, utilities are putting forward massive rate hikes, home insurance rates are rising, and that hits renters and homeowners alike. But as I was driving around Maine this summer while I was on vacation, I noticed something, and that's that electric heat pumps are everywhere, from rich vacation or seaside houses to mobile homes. And why is that? It's because Maine has one of the best heat pump programs in the country. A public institution called Efficiency Maine runs a rebate and lending program that's deployed close to 200,000 heat pumps to some of the most rural areas in the nation just in the span of 5 years. If you're under a certain income level, you basically get heat pumps for free. And hundreds of small businesses have popped up to install heat pumps, supported by community college training programs to train the installers. And the program's taking families off of extremely expensive and dirty heating oil. And that's the kind of program that's indicative of the kind of transformative climate policies that are urgently needed. It's got to become common sense for working people to hear climate policy and know it's for them. And, like Ben said, should be designed by them. Climate policy simply cannot be all Priuses and convoluted tax credits that only rich people can access. And again, as Ben said, this is one of the problems with the IRA. It was so removed from people's everyday lives and moved so slowly, there was virtually no one willing to defend it. So to get to the conditions where we can win these quick transformative programs, we need narrative and coalition strategies that drive demand for transformative economic action that brings these serious climate benefits, like what Efficiency Maine is doing. And at the Climate and Community Institute, our narrative and coalition strategy for this is green economic populism. Green, because the climate crisis is just that, a crisis we have to act on. Economic, because it has to take on the unaffordability that people are suffering through and the rigged rules that make a brighter future harder and harder to imagine, along with the sclerotic institutions that Gretchen was mentioning. We need state capacity in order to be able to deploy these quickly. It's not just a matter of regulatory burden. It's a matter of underpowered institutions that are driving these investments in transformative climate action. And they have to be populist because climate policy has to resonate and mobilize a political base that's ready to fight for a different future. And the headline for that future isn't just going to be about molecules as much as some of us enjoy talking about that aspect. It has to be about climate policy you can touch. We have to be clear about who the villains are, who's slowing it down, how people will materially benefit, and what kinds of institutions we need to make it happen. And the coalitions that'll win green economic populist aligned policies look different from place to place. Organized labor is still mighty in key jurisdictions and sectors. We can think about teachers' unions that are putting climate into their contract demands that'll drive investments to schools that will both electrify the school buildings and make them resilience hubs in disadvantaged communities. We can look at California, where the United Auto Workers are teaming up with environmental justice coalitions to ensure that the benefits of manufacturing supply chains that rely on lithium are equitably distributed. Or we can look at New York, another place where change is happening very rapidly, where a hugely diverse coalition fought for and won the Build Public Renewables Act that's speeding towards its target of 7 gigawatts of new publicly owned renewables, and where teachers' unions are pushing to double that by 2030. There'll be other parts of these coalitions as well. Of course, the administration's done quite a bit to alienate big segments of green capital, particularly offshore wind, but also including solar. They'll need to be enrolled. Tenants are on the front lines of the climate crisis and bearing some of the heaviest economic burdens of anyone. But they're increasingly organized through tenants unions in places like Kansas City and Rhode Island. They'll need to be enrolled. Or we can look at the increasingly powerful coalitions all over the country who are fighting the disastrous rollout of data centers, a place where we can see that building is possible very quickly, right? But these coalitions that are fighting them are increasingly winning, backed by national formations like the NAACP, as well as traditional climate organizations. And then, of course, we'll need scientists and bureaucrats, along with politicians who are willing to fight for these policies, and media who will boost them. So there will invariably be challenges in terms of speed and scale, but we don't even get to have that fight if we don't win the narrative battle and build the coalitions that we need to get there.
So you're saying a lot of the progress can be had at the state level first, seems to be the takeaway.
Yeah, I think that is a takeaway. I mean, we certainly cannot give up on federal action. We know that the climate action is going to be expensive, and all of this money will not come from the private sector. So we're going to need big federal investments, and the power of the purse is real. But nonetheless, local and state level action is probably more promising in the short term. And it doesn't have to be, big flashy things. It can be things like Efficiency Maine. It could be things like, one of my favorite programs in the country, Pennsylvania's Whole Homes Repair Act, that stood up a fund to do home retrofits just to get houses up to code so that they were eligible for various energy efficiency programs. Oftentimes that's a precondition for accessing public assistance or public programs. But it didn't just provide money for these home upgrades or retrofits. It also provided training to local workforces, and it provided county level one-stop shops at every county across the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania to help homeowners understand how to access different programs, how to find a reputable contractor, how to measure their energy efficiency gains, right? All of these things that you need to help people understand both how to access the programs and how the programs are benefiting them, such that maybe they're more inclined to look favorably on even more transformative climate policy.
Thanks so much. Really, really helpful. Ted, let me turn to you. Your vision, at least from one paper, the Anti-Climate Common Sense paper, it seems to me really asserts that a return to belief in cost, energy demand, supply chain security, competitiveness, all those things that are at the heart of renewable technologies. I think my understanding was that you think those will be perhaps not enough, but certainly a big part of how climate action returns to the political agenda and the policy agenda. Is that fair? And if not, what else is required besides just the economic merits of the technology?
Well, thanks for having me and thanks for the question. Let me just say an important disclaimer from the start, which is just that I'm discussing an article I wrote as a concerned citizen, and nothing I wrote there or say here represents the views of the Blue-Green Alliance or of any of our coalition partners, including the Union of Concerned Scientists represented on the stage. I was going to take maybe one step back and just set the scene, which is that the piece I wrote in the discussion I think we want to have is motivated by, in a sense, that the terrain for advancing climate action has gotten much rockier, and not just in the immediate term. And in the piece I sketch all of the reasons why I think that's so, but I want to focus on a particularly, let's say, insidious aspect of what's going on, which I would describe as a deliberate effort that Trump and his allies are undertaking to eviscerate what had become the common sense around climate change and around climate action society-wide. Some of the key elements of that common sense were that global warming is real and that it's anthropogenic, that as emissions accumulate and temperatures rise, ecological and economic systems will be destabilized, and that presages a future that is considerably worse for human civilization. And the prospect of that future and the increasing signs of it in the present will ultimately force governments to act to restrict carbon emissions one way or another. In other words, the future is or will be carbon constrained. And in a future that everyone believes will be carbon constrained, exercises a kind of causal effect on actions in the present through a variety of channels. I think the simplest way to think about this is that it affects the perceived balance of risks for actors across society. So companies, investors, governments at every level, but also individuals. And I think the risks being balanced are, on the one hand, the risk of moving too slowly to prepare for a carbon-constrained future, right? This is a risk of other countries or other companies or other people somehow winning out and reaping the rewards and the benefits of adapting to a carbon-constrained or low-carbon future. But there's also the sort of opposing risk, which is the risk that many actors will feel of moving somehow too quickly, right? The risk, especially because there are opportunity costs to climate action in the present, right? There's money that has to be spent, there's investments that have to be made, and in some cases there may be assets that have to be written off. So I think one of the reasons that many of us thought, or at least some of us thought, that Biden-era climate action would be resilient to attempts at rollback has to do with our assessment that the new common sense around climate had quite dramatically shifted actors' perceptions of the relative weight of those risks, and they had shifted them in favor of accelerated action in the present. Then we had a mix of investments in the form of the IRA, especially, as well as regulations that, if they weren't always welcomed, at least they were accepted by key actors because they helped pave the way towards a future that these actors believed they were headed towards anyway. That is, the risk assessment had already shifted, and Biden-era policy reinforced it by lowering the opportunity cost to action now and by furthering the conviction that the trend of policy was towards constraining carbon in the future. If you want to think of an example, just something like EVs as a very, I think, salient case where there was a growing sense that one way or another, companies, automakers were going to have to adapt to a world in which carbon was constrained and more vehicles needed to be electric or low emissions in one way or another. There were investments that needed to happen to make that possible. The IRA smoothed the way to a lot of those investments, right? It provided a lot of capital and a lot of incentives to make it possible and economically feasible in the immediate term to make those investments. And regulations reinforced the sense that this was the trajectory for the future. So coupled with a huge range of co-benefits of the variety that Ben in particular touched on, that seemed designed to make climate policy broadly popular, there was every reason to think that we were entering a world of what I would call positive climate policy feedback loops. And what I think Trump and his hangers-on are doing is not just reversing policies, but actually attempting a radical backwards ratchet of expectations about the future of policy. And in doing so, they are shifting the balance of risks that those actors perceived. And the reason this matters, in my view, is because of its potential to affect public and private investment in ways that causes the universe of stakeholders whose prosperity depends on carbon-intensive economic activity to remain steady or even to increase. And every individual, every company, every regional economy whose well-being depends on carbon-intensive activity is likely to be either an opponent of climate action in their future, or at least they're a constituency that has to be offered what some scholars have called a decarbonization bargain. And the more time that passes and the more those constituencies grow, the more expensive those bargains become and the less climate progress policy can deliver. The less climate policy action our politics can deliver, the less actors believe that carbon constraints are going to be binding anytime soon, and the more the climate coalition shrinks. And this is a world of negative climate policy feedback loops. And it's what I think we need to be focusing our attention right now. How do we prevent those from happening? I think the coalition question is central to this. And the question is, how do we keep people inside the pro-climate coalition? And that's a challenging question that I think both Ben and Patrick and Gretchen as well are speaking to, right? We have to identify the concrete interests that people have in a low carbon future, in climate action, right? And the concrete ways that we can demonstrate that climate action is going to bring them closer to that. And we have to do it in a context where a lot of people and people in power are trying to convince them of the exact opposite, right? People are trying to convince them that their lives will actually be worse if climate action proceeds. There's a threat, right, in doing that the climate coalition really shrinks, and that makes our lives, incrementally harder at every step.
Thanks, Ted. Just going back once to Ben, and then we'll open it up for questions. How do we build this coalition? You have an idea about, going local, really bottom-up models for decision-making. Just really briefly, how would you characterize that approach?
Yeah. It's a great question, and I think it's an essential question right before us. And it's a yes and to Ted and to Patrick, I think, who named a few examples of these coalitions that are working on the ground. Look, I don't think people are likely to call for investments that they don't see themselves in. And I don't think people are likely to see themselves in investments that they did not themselves help to build, right? And yet the project of building climate policy to date has been largely a project of the professional class. I don't think the path forward, and I don't think this is controversial, but I don't think the path forward is for a bunch of DC professionals like myself to bust out of our offices in 3 years and say, hey, guess what, working America? We've designed IRA 2.0, and trust us, it's going to be great for your family and your community. I think that would fall flat, right? The workers and communities who most stand to benefit from a next wave of climate investments really need to be involved in helping to craft those investments. I think that inclusion is critical both to get the policies right and to build the power to get the policies passed. I mean, there's a number of wonks in the room, so let me just say, this is not a screed against wonks. I myself am one, right? Like we wonks bring a fair amount of technical expertise to the table that is essential for crafting policies. But we often are missing some on-the-ground information for how those policies are actually going to play out in communities, the so-called last mile of policy implementation. And that's information that organizers can readily provide if they're brought into the policymaking process. But more than just the policy content, an inside baseball approach really risks anemic policy pushes by seeding opportunities to build power. If we were to try to design the next big thing in climate action in the DC bubble alone, I don't think it would result in a passed policy, but yet another white paper. Thankfully, I think there's real near-term opportunities in front of us to actually feed more of a bottom-up, inclusive model of policy design, and that's happening right now at the city and state level. You mentioned, is state action the path forward? I think yes is largely the answer. Right now, you have a number of cities and states who, in the next 2 years, have an actual realistic chance of passing affordable housing, affordable energy, affordable transportation policies that double as climate solutions. Could we equip labor groups, community groups in those same communities to actually be involved in the crafting of those policies And to do so, we need not dwell in theory. It's not like we've never done this before. There are existing models of groups coming together and efficiently crafting policies and succeeding in getting those policies across the finish line. Just one quick example, and then I'll close. In Illinois, we had about 20-odd climate, faith, labor groups come together in like church basements and rec centers to hash out with state legislative staff what they wanted to see in a state climate bill. The legislators then helped them translate those high-level priorities into the technical prose of legislation. And then because there was this really big tent involvement in crafting the bill, there was an equally big tent advocacy and organizing and comms push to get the thing over the finish line over some entrenched interests. And it is not coincidental that that inclusive process produced one of the more ambitious and equitable state climate laws we've seen to date. But it's the exception, it's not the rule. And I think that if we can cultivate more of those inclusive processes in more places, it will build broader buy-in for this agenda, an agenda that we can actually scale up to the national level. So like in sum, I don't think any of us are saying that we need to like chuck out the everything bagel. I think what we need to do is design a next chapter of policies that enable the original climate jobs justice vision to come to fruition. Can we design policies, a next phase of policies that tackle affordability, that expedite clean energy, and that bring more people into the process of crafting our own solutions? I think we can. I mean, I think we must. And if we do, I think it will yield a national agenda that responds to on-the-ground priorities, and that is popular, an agenda that we can actually win.
So that would require, really what you're favoring is a different kind of governance in terms of at least policy design. And what brings all those folks together is the different ingredients of the bagel, right? They all have to see something in it that their communities can value.
They absolutely have to, and this is not to be Pollyannish to say it's easy going. You have to navigate policy trade-offs, but we have multiple examples of participatory processes in U.S. cities and U.S. states navigating trade-offs effectively, resulting in a passed policy.
Got it. Let me open it up to the audience. I know that you've been very patient sitting on questions from both first and second panels. Feel free to raise any questions for both panels. Panel one is sitting here as well. Yes, go ahead, sir.
Hi, Todd Tucker, Roosevelt Institute. Thanks so much for organizing this great event. My takeaway from the two panels is that affordability is in and China bashing is out. And I guess I wanted to kick the tires on that a little bit in the following sense. And sort of whether that agenda could really be sort of the basis of a new social contract between federal policymakers that have to deliver the policy and sort of the public that has to support it. I guess on the one thing on the 2 points on the affordability, are federal policymakers going to take the full spectrum of actions that they would need to take to actually contain prices in a way that voters are going to recognize? I'm thinking of things like price controls and sort of other very controversial interventions that, like, where a policymaker could say, we did that, and then therefore the affordability promise was delivered. The second point, on the types of transmission mechanisms that we're talking about here, which is that we hope that clean energy is cheap, so therefore it will lead to sort of reductions in prices. Are policymakers going to be able to claim the credit for that outcome on the ground? I mean, I think what we saw with the IRA is that, local mayors, local firms, local businesses have every incentive in the world to disguise the federal policy footprint in a lot of those things. So can we build a sort of a new feedback loop that sort of rewards the politicians that are taking the risk? And then sort of finally on the China point, I think that we're talking about we're having this conversation in the context of government shutdown. It's clear that there's almost nothing that the political parties in this town agree on. The one thing continues to remain, and maybe it shouldn't be, is concerns about China competition. And so I wonder, what do we give up as if we sort of are taking that off the table, because it is sort of like one of the only things that is motivating bipartisan action at this point.
Got it. Let me collect a couple more. Right here.
Thank you very much. Bada Whelan from a non-profit organization. Although this is not my area, energy is not my area, I'm an economist, but I like the last intervention, can you hear me? Particularly popular participation in designing policies, not only energy and climate policies, but policies in general, social, economic policies that concern people's well-being and so on. So I think there should be a general framework, not only restricted to a particular sector, but in totality. Because if it's a democracy, there has to be popular participation, not only municipal level and so on, but actually at the grassroots level, villages, in the remote areas, and everybody, because everybody is affected by that, and they should have a stake. And any policy that has a wider stakes in its formulation will have a greater chances of being implemented because there is accountability on both sides. So I think this should be something which needs to be underscored. The other point I want to say is policies, particularly in the United States, are, because it's a very different system, it's considered private sector driving. So the public sector, maybe in terms of more or as a vigilante to see if you follow the rules and regulations as regulatory rather than a designer and implementer. So in that case, what's the role of the oil and gas lobbies, which actually drive and shape and design these policies? Thank you.
Let me go to panel one and ask them a couple of things. China bashing, is it helpful? I think you seem to suggest that it's no longer very popular, but that used to be the only glue that held bipartisanship together. Affordability. In Climate Clarity, there's a lot of discussion about the causal linkages between more renewables and lower prices of electricity in the house. It's a complex chain. Who gets the credit? I think it's another one for the panel. The last one really, I think it's about, I would rephrase it to say, in order to have more participatory policy making, we need to have perhaps a breadth of fresh democratic governance at the local level. Is that something that is realistic given the larger crisis of democracy that the system is facing? Anyone in China?
I think that the idea that there's a universal or bipartisan consensus on China bashing is, I think, overstated. And I think it was always overstated. I think there was a lot of performance in that, and that there was not a lot of depth to it. I think that in the current administration, I think there is at least one individual who happens to be the President of the United States who I think is not particularly interested in China bashing. At this moment, he has been at various points in the past, but right now I think is much more interested in a deal. And so I could imagine a world in which Chinese investments in the auto sector or in kind of various other are on the table. And I think thinking through what is the right way for climate activists and action to take place in that world is of critical importance.
Quickly on affordability and who might get the blame for higher prices, there's some new polling this week that suggests that people are most likely to blame state governments, utility companies, and rising demand, especially from data centers. So it's not clear that the party that controls the White House and Congress now will get the blame for that. And Todd, I think you made a good point about will the government take the steps needed to make things more affordable? With electricity prices, the best that can be hoped for is to slow the rate of increase. And so there would need to be action to mask the increases. It's not realistic that power prices for residential consumers are just going to go down.
I see. One last thing. Just a two-finger on affordability, emphasizing the heat pump plan in Maine. Thinking about how we can structure policies to not be a rebate that someone gets at the end of the year, but something that is immediate and that has those sort of tangential, or not tangential, but direct results, has to be the priority.
One last piece on affordability, but kind of the comms piece, Todd. You were talking about, like, how do we win the win, essentially? If we're going to do things that deliver on affordability, how do we communicate to people that the federal government did it. I feel like there's a whole comm strategy to talk about, and thinking about the IRA, there wasn't a president who could necessarily sell the agenda or talk about the IRA in a very compelling or effective way. And so I feel like there's a lot of lessons we could learn from like the New Deal era. I feel like FDR had some really interesting like films and videos about the New Deal and some of the public investments. And so I would love to think about like short form video, some of the new innovations with social media, how we could communicate about like both things that are like wins, material wins, physical infrastructure, but also, how to access, if we do tax credits for EVs again, how can we communicate better with everyday folks? I also feel like Holly Buck has written some interesting things about like a climate core for like having young people communicate to others, like what's happening in their community. How can you access solar panels? I feel like there are really interesting things we could think about that would be innovative to kind of win the win and message on whatever the next federal climate policy is.
I just wanted to leave everyone with the image of an AI-generated FDR in a short-form video talking about heat pumps, because I think that's something we might see very soon.
Anybody want to jump in on democracy?
Sure. Go ahead.
A couple of things I would just say on that. So one, to this broader conversation, especially in this era where we're seeing the democratic backsliding and the gutting of science and expertise and institutions, I think that means it's all the more important that we keep the score, that the scientific community, that the truth tellers, the academics, the intellectuals, the people that are able to speak truth to power continue to do so. And I think we need to do that at the individual level and at the institutional level. And one huge thing in our favor in that regard that I think can be a political opportunity and a messaging opportunity if we want, is that the numbers don't lie, and that's true in a few ways. It's true on climate impacts, right? We're going to see more and more every day extreme weather, climate-related risks happening. The impacts of those on grid reliability, on cost to consumers will be very apparent more and more every day. And so that element is true, and on the renewable energy affordability and the degree to which it is cheaper to deploy renewables right now, as the first panel discussed more. And so, we have all that in our favor, that it's very readily available and it's clear. And if we have the right messengers and we have the right coalitions in place and people see it more and more in their day-to-day, that's a big opportunity to tell that story, both on demonstrating harms of what's happening and who's responsible for those harms, and on the opportunity of what we can do and how we can have nice things if we are continuing down this path of deploying that technology and thinking big and expecting more of our government.
Let me collect two final questions, please.
I think it's important for us to keep in mind that there are still significant numbers of people who don't make the real connection between extreme weather events and climate change. This is particularly true, although not uniquely true, although much more true of Republicans than it is of Democrats. This is despite years and years of efforts, including by UCS and Climate Central and others, to actually make that connection obvious. It kind of gets through on heat, but especially on anything that is other than heat. There's still a lot to be done, and I'm wondering if any of the panelists have any bright ideas on how that might be accomplished.
Well, we could try the AI-generated FDR video as an option as our next campaign.
You're the only one who's gone viral here, so you would know.
Hello, my name is Bronson Shepard. I'm an economics student. And before I get to my question, I just really quickly want to say that it has been very heartening to hear from you guys and be reminded of all the good and smart people who are doing work to help our planet. And my question, which is, you guys have already touched on it a little bit, but how can the Climate Coalition and institutions adapt to the new media landscape, especially in the light of the fact that it's easier for our opposition to tell 10 lies, and it's much quicker than for us to respond and give facts?
Let me do one more. Just behind you, Aislinn.
Thanks for the conversation, Matthias Rickman. I'm a reporter with Germany's DW. I was wondering, maybe this is more towards the first panel, because you're painting this picture of where the US could go. And I'm just wondering if the new denialists win and clean tech isn't inevitable in the United States, where will that leave the US geopolitically, maybe in 10 years?
You guys want to take the final one? Let's do that one first, and then the other two.
Starting with that last point, the U.S. Let's paint this scenario out. The U.S. experiences a more severe war on all facets of clean energy, barring those that are outlined in the Energy Dominance Council. So, nuclear, geothermal, potentially hydro, not a lot of opportunity. And the EV situation that was described here really elegantly by Ted remains locked in the ice age, so to speak. This leaves the U.S. essentially, geopolitically, before talking about technologies, the U.S. base case is heading to a more isolated place right now. We see that with what's happened with India recently, and India's kind of new rapprochement with China. I think is a really stark example. And the question separately becomes: how does the climate coalition evolve without the U.S., with it on the outskirts? I think the main other dynamic is that we'll lock into a pretty severe tariff rate, and our industries in general may just become less competitive. So it paints a scenario where there are not a lot of tools left in the toolbox to necessarily play the type of collaborative and constructive role that we're describing. That being said, many of these technologies that I had previously mentioned, industrial decarbonization, advanced geothermal, could very well survive and be moving forward. So I do not want to paint a kind of brutally fossil entrenched, grim picture, but to also say there will be some glimmers of opportunity despite the severity of the war the actions taking place against clean technologies.
In one sentence, the U.S. risks squabbling with other petrostates over a stagnant market.
Narrative, a different argument. It goes back to your narrative, a different argument. It goes back to your point of electricity costs, which are going, it's a matter of slowing them down, not reversing them, right? So what do I mean by merging? I'm going to be in Phoenix next week talking with a bunch of labor unions and affordable housing advocates who are coming together to try to design municipal policy to expand green affordable housing. This is affordable housing that's going to cut your rent and mortgage. It's going to provide good union construction jobs, and it's going to be electrified and energy efficient houses, so as to also cut your utility bills and your home insurance rates. So it will cut the 15% of climate pollution that comes from our homes. We might not lead with that, but we can lead with actual diminished like rent and mortgage, utility bills, and home insurance rates, which are real. That's not hand wavy. That's not Pollyannish. That's actually going to deliver. So that's what I mean by a merger of climate and affordability priorities. Just on this last question on media, which also ties in with the earlier democracy question, look, man, if you got an idea for how to build a massive media infrastructure that we need to be able to tell truth, that is a project that some people should definitely take on. I'm not going to try to resolve all of that in one question. What I will say is one piece of that I think we need to do better at is equipping local messengers who are designing their own solutions. Right, we have this tendency to, whenever we have big federal policy pushes, to, do these big ribbon cuttings on new facilities, which is great, and we should do that. But could we do more to equip like the local reverend or imam, or like the Main Street business owner, or like the union local president, to come out and speak on behalf of investments that they themselves have called for a long time in their own communities? And the one quick example on that is, there's in Los Angeles, a number of unions came together with, again, affordable housing advocates to design what's now known as the mansion tax in Los Angeles. And they had a bunch of differences between them. They didn't agree on the everything bagel. They didn't always, there was policy trade-offs around labor and housing prices. But they came together and said, we see common cause in trying to design a solution in a bottom-up way. And they built a proposal that is the mansion tax. They came up with a compromise, basically, on project labor agreements for affordable housing. And it resulted in an agreement. And because they had agreement, you had full-throated endorsement from unions and affordable housing advocates speaking to their own base that they should really push for and advocate for this policy. And they put it to a ballot measure in the city of Los Angeles. And because there was a full-throated organizing and communications push from these builders of the policy to their own large base in Los Angeles, it got majority support and passed into law. And while it's not free of trade-offs, that policy today is the largest source of affordable housing revenue in the city of Los Angeles. And the first tranche of projects are creating 10,000 union construction jobs. Who are the best messengers to talk about that win and how it was an affordability solution and a job solution and a climate solution? They are the people who actually built the policy themselves. They are the affordable housing advocates. They are the union presidents. So I think we need to do a better job of recognizing local leaders as the agents of the change that we need to see and its spokespeople.
Thanks so much. I'm afraid we've run out of time. To your point on faith-based communities, I believe Pope Leo gave a speech today in commemorating the 10 years of Laudato Si, the encyclical, so it might be interesting to look at. Please read Climate Clarity. I hope that you'll find it stimulating. Talk to folks about it. What we're going to do here is we're going to delve more deeply over the coming weeks through the research to understand better what the academic literature is telling us about the linkages between climate action on one hand and affordability and health on the other. We want to be systematic, rigorous, and then I think come back to the conversation of governance and coalitions. So thank you so much for being here, and please keep the dialogue going. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good.